Hey everyone, it's Adrielle. Welcome back to another episode of DEI in 5. If you're new here, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. I am joined today with Tyanan Allan, who is a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant. He is also the host and founder of Culturing, which is an amazing podcast about all things culture, tapping into fuel for growth within your company. He is also a writer and content creator on LinkedIn, which is how we connected. And I had the pleasure of having a really great conversation with him last week. And I was like, hey, you want to come pop on DEI in 5? Because why not? But we had this conversation where we were talking about equity, pay equity. We were talking about how that fits into DEI, and how there is such a need for people to pay a little bit more attention to policy, and that includes pay equity, of course, and how we have seen so much distraction with what I consider to be sort of the low-hanging fruit, which is usually like the programmatic efforts of celebrating cultural heritage months, awareness months, ERGs, all important things, but we had this great conversation where we were like, yes, we still also have to recognize that we need to pay a little bit more attention to our processes, our systems, our policies, like pay equity. And so I just wanted to invite you on to chat more about that. I feel like this is one of your areas of expertise. I dabble in it here and there, but I spend most of my time working with leaders and building workshops. So would love to just hear your thoughts, and figure we'd have a quick little 10-minute pop-up to chat about all things DEI policy and pay equity.
That's amazing. Well, thank you. I feel like I invited myself onto your podcast. So like,
that works too.
I'm like, just put myself out there. No, I'm just kidding. But I think when we were talking about this, it's like that frustration amongst DEI professionals like ourselves, where you go into these organizations and you see them honestly doing a lot and having really good intentions. And then I think my heart just sort of breaks when a lot of the time you see that a lot of it is not providing the fruit that they think it does, right? The effects, the long-term benefits, like that stuff that doesn't stick around for long and needs to be done annually, right? Like putting together Black History Month programming, Latinx Heritage Month programming, National Indigenous Day programming, like all these things, incredibly important and need to be recognized, celebrated, lifted up. But, they're not long lasting. And oftentimes it actually makes things there is quite a bit of research, and I don't have it like on the top of my head, but there's more research coming out about how sometimes a focus on like specific groups, specifically underrepresented groups, can actually be harmful to those groups, right? It can cause this resentment from other employees about like, let's take, Black folks like us, where it's like, okay, great, we get our whole month, and then March comes around, and naturally it's not good, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There's going to be some folks that are like, okay, you had your month, now your time is done, right? Yeah. Now, who's that actually helping or harming? It's still harming the Black folks. And so it's this battle of like, where can we make things behind the scenes more effective and, more sort of equitable, without it necessarily having to celebrate or bring so much attention to, these equity deserving groups. And I think an analogy I like to make, because I've seen it personally, is that oftentimes the thing that you're celebrated for is the exact same thing that puts a target on your back. Mm-hmm. And so I've had it where I've been the person leading the Black History Month, event, and, calling out racism or calling out things we can do better. And next thing I know, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, that's a dagger in the back of my back, like, oh, that's an arrow coming my way. Oh, that's something I've got to dodge. And you just don't quite realize at the time that oftentimes these efforts can really, not do us any favors. And so that's what got me thinking, just in my career, in my work, of like, there's people that are doing really, really amazing work in these
Yeah.
spaces, planning great events, planning great programs, building great courses like yourself. I feel like I can't even do what they're doing. I don't know enough. Like, I don't know
Hmm.
enough about all the histories of all Indigenous people and Black people, and like it's just like a lot. My brain doesn't work like that. But I'm
Sure.
like, what can I do behind the scenes? And that's what started I started to train myself to think, what are the like small things, the behind the scenes things, the things that are maybe a little bit more hidden or more entrenched in ways of working that we could start to shift. And I think a great example that is quite, prevalent in the media right now is pay transparency laws, right? And really what
Right.
this means typically is it has to do with job postings. That's the main one that's focused on in the laws.
Hmm.
And so often it's that a company that's posting a job needs to provide a salary range publicly of what that job will be paid if that person will be paid if they get the job.
Right.
And
Right.
so, New York City was like one of the big ones that like launched it. People were like, yes. And
Yes.
obviously, a major proportion of the United States population lives there. So it really raised the number. Right now, I think there's about 8 states that have pay transparency laws, and it actually makes up about 26.6% of Americans that have a law that governs that if they're applying to a job in their city or state, that they should be seeing a salary range before they apply. So
Yeah.
again, this is really, really interesting. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just thinking about, I knew you were going to say the salary range, and I just, every time I see those, I get there's pay transparency, and I'm glad to see
Uh-huh,
it. But at the
uh-huh.
same time, it's so frustrating to see
Hmm.
like a salary range that's like 78K to 190K,
I know. You're like,
like depending on
who are
experience.
these
Like,
people? Like, that's 7 different jobs in between that you should be hiring for if you're gonna,
right,
right? And so
right.
again, this is one of those things that we're still very much so scratching the surface. I'm a thousand
Yes.
percent with you. The range
Hmm.
can be so problematic. And
Yep.
at the same time, I'm like, there's still people that have no freaking clue
Hmm.
what range they're in, what range they should be going for, what range they're worth.
Right.
The other part of it that's nice, because again, a lot of these laws don't yet, and I hope they do eventually,
Hmm.
target people that already have jobs. But what it can do is it can indicate to the people inside of companies, again, it's still not great. It's still like,
Right.
okay, you work at a company, you're already in a job, you didn't have this pay transparency when you were starting, but now,
Hmm.
somebody that's getting hired for a similar job to you, you can go and look at that job posting and be like, okay, where am I at?
Right.
So it kind of helps those people, but it's still awkward that like, okay, you have to kind of work for it instead of it just being fair and equitable. Anyways, I think what's interesting to me about these things is that what most companies don't realize, what most HR folks or recruiters don't realize, is
Hmm.
how a lot of the things that are common to HR folks are not common amongst the majority of people, right? The
Yeah.
average person is not taught exactly how to write a resume so that it makes it through an applicant tracking system or an ATS. That's
Hmm.
not, very few schools teach that well. Plus, every company does it a little bit differently. So let's
Yep.
say now you have your head of HR that's been at a company for 25 years. And now, again, this is talking about those entrenched policy things. Well, they now have this mindset of like, well, this is how it should be done. This is what a resume looks like. This is how you should write your resume. This is how the format should be. It should be in a doc file, not a PDF, or it should be a PDF, not a
Hmm.
doc. And again, this only goes up with equity deserving groups, right? We know that, in a lot of, different ethnicities and different cultures, immigrant families, the parents don't often have a ton of professional experience. Maybe they work more
Hmm.
labor jobs. So they've never really had to focus on like what a corporate resume needs to look like, right? So then
Sure.
you're at a greater disadvantage. Everyone's kind of at a disadvantage because the average school just doesn't teach it, but it even goes
Hmm.
higher, in other facets. Or for example, like women, I've heard many things about how like women's like the father who has the job at home doesn't teach their daughter and only teaches their sons, right? Those sort of things that pushes people back, pushes women back. It's not right, but it's a reality that many people live with. And so all I'm kind of saying, like we started talking about pay transparency laws.
Yeah.
And we're starting to, like, I'm starting to see that behind the scenes, there's so much opportunity for HR folks, policymakers, employment law people within companies to start to just like kind of take these things on. Number one, I recommend don't waiting for the laws to take these things on, right? But number two, you do have a lot more power than you realize. So here's a couple examples. So again, if we go back to pay transparency, if you know that you are probably going to be operating in a state that's going to have a pay transparency law, and now we're knowing that like probably by the end of next year there'll be like almost 50% of states that have something to do with this.
Right.
You probably don't have any reason to not start thinking about introducing pay transparency in your job postings, right? So I would just say to yourself, if you're like waiting for the law, do you really care that much about equity? If you know that it's coming, if you know that it's the right thing, if there's lawmakers who, you know, are looking at all the data and the research about how pay transparency laws, although imperfect, still have, you know, shown to decrease pay gaps between gender, between race, between people with disabilities. If we know that that's happening, and you know that that's a tool that can be used to limit those pay gaps, then what are you waiting for?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I've seen. I'll tell you what I've seen in terms of why people are waiting. Money. So, especially now, given how volatile the economy is, and I've seen this for many years now, one of the main reasons why, I remember one organization that I worked with in particular, they did everything they could to try to push back and avoid having someone come in to do a
pay equity
kind of audit. Yes. Yeah. And the reason was because they knew that people were receiving such widely different compensation packages, and not just salaries, but like it was so varied for the same roles and levels of experience in terms of how much like equity people were receiving in terms of like stock options, that kind of thing. And so this is, I think a lot of organizations are holding out until the last minute because they're like, oh, until we're forced to, because depending on their size, they're going to have to do a lot of work. And to your earlier point, once you start to share these salary ranges, if I already work here, you best believe I'm going to look online to see how much my, you know, other people are making on my team. Also, people talk, especially, I think we're seeing so many generations within the workplace now, but I've noticed with younger generations that are entering or that have entered the workforce, there's a lot more transparency around this stuff because people are constantly seeking out fairness. Whereas in the past and with older generations, you tend to see this kind of like, we're going to stay hush hush about how much I'm making. Like, I don't want to share this. And so people I see it all the time on social media where, especially Black and brown people, I will say, because that's what I've seen. I don't have any data. This is anecdotally, but from what I've seen, I'm constantly seeing Black and brown people post about how they recently discovered they were making significantly less than their counterparts who have the same or less experience. And well, so I think that's why.
That is wild too. So for example, there are the highest educated population in the United States right now is Black women, right? Like there's like I think it's to do with like the degrees, right? Like I think there's more, like the percentage of Black women who have like graduate degrees, I'm pretty sure is higher than like any other, you know, group. Like there, or at least I think I saw maybe it's coming, but again, it's like the education usually is much more stacked for Black and brown folks. And so, it often, it's added kind of fuel to the fire of like, okay, so now you're also, you know, less experienced and you're getting paid more. Like that's really
Yeah.
wild. Um, so yes, I get 100% that a lot of these folks are waiting to the last minute. I think the
Hmm.
caution is that, again, what's so interesting, and I think if you know you're talking to folks that have gone through this process, it isn't an
Yeah.
overnight process. And so that's the other thing that people need to start realizing. It isn't just that one day you start to post, pay transparency and salary ranges. That's not how
Hmm.
it works. You have to start to actually realize what your salary ranges are. A lot of
Hmm.
companies do not have a good salary range for most roles. And they definitely don't have a rubric for how they determine it. So
Right.
that's a great place to start. Even if you don't
Yeah.
even post it, but just internally starting to go through the process of being like, okay, how do we define roles and job descriptions? And then how do we,
Hmm.
start to kind of codify or create a process around if this job in this department does this work, what salary range is appropriate? And
Yeah.
when is like what's the so for example, let's say it's the base role,
Hmm.
junior role, what differentiates the responsibilities of a junior to a senior role, and
Hmm.
therefore what's the salary, right? So for example, like
Right.
going back to what you were saying, like, okay, there's a 70K to 190K based on experience. No, 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 no,
Hmm.
no. If it's anything, in my opinion, more than 25K varied, maybe 30, that's a different job, and there should be
Yeah.
different responsibilities attached to it. And that's
Right.
warranted, right? If you
Hmm.
are more experienced and you deserve 30K more than somebody else at the company because of what you're going to bring to the table, then you should actually have the permission to bring that to the table. And that should be a different job, a different title, a different set of responsibilities. Even if it's only like two different responsibilities,
Yeah.
it's still something
Absolutely.
different, and it should be like broken up that way. So
Yeah.
again, if you're not thinking like that in your department, or even again, you like there's a lot of freedom in hiring. If you start to
Hmm.
hire and you find a really amazing candidate, and you are now ready and willing to offer them more money, you're now
Hmm.
excited about them, you're realizing what they're going to bring to the team. Here's the reality: if you do that and you go through all the behind the scenes stuff, you're going to pay them more, you're negotiating with them, you're excited about them, you're like, oh yeah, you're going to be great at this job, you can come and mentor people. If you don't
Right.
take the time to go into their job description and into their job title and make a few shifts, then
Hmm.
they're going to come 6 months down the road, and they're gonna have been thrown into the same pool as the people making 30K less than them, and they're gonna
Yeah.
feel a way about it. They're either
Yeah.
going to have felt like they're not being challenged, they're going to either have felt like they're doing more work than they were hired to do,
Hmm.
right? You're running into engagement and employee engagement problems. And a lot
Yeah.
of hiring managers, a lot of HR folks don't recognize that when they find that all-star candidate they're excited to hire for, but it's actually even different than what the job description was. There's a
Hmm.
lot of issues that come down the road. So this is why it's like the behind the scenes things, the policy
Yeah.
side, the creating rubrics on how you determine what job makes what salary.
Hmm.
I think another example that I often like to give is like most companies have very, very little
Hmm.
documentation and policy and procedure around terminations. There's
Yeah.
almost no standard. The majority of companies can basically go and have a manager. It can be one complaint against somebody to a manager. The manager can be like, do I agree or not agree? And
Yeah.
within a matter of days, if not a week, a person can be fired. And the majority of both in Canada and the US, which is what I'm most
Hmm.
familiar with, there's called at will employment, which basically
Right.
means you are hired or working at will, and so it's like my will as a company to pay you, and if I don't
Hmm.
like you, you're gone. And usually it's like 1 week to 2 weeks. That's like the average that somebody has to be paid if they're not given any notice.
Right.
If you are
Right.
given even 2 weeks notice, you often don't have to be paid anything. And if you're fired with cause, usually don't have to be paid for anything. So again, if you want to be on the kind of more cutting edge of doing equity work, start to put in some level of process and procedure around how someone gets terminated. If it's, provable, like think about it. And this is also the really interesting thing too. Oftentimes the other thing that people are kind of stricken with. So for example, in Canada, which is what I know better because I live here, when you let's say, Adriel, I'm your manager and I'm about to fire you. Okay. I'm going to hand you your termination agreement. And because you've worked for less than a year here, I only have to give you 1 week's salary. But I might actually give you 2 to 4 weeks salary, or maybe even 2 months because I'm nice. Sure. But what I'm going to include in that termination agreement is a clause that says, I, as the person being terminated, will not or have not filed a complaint to the discrimination board, or in Canada, it's like the Employment Equity Act, or the, there's these different sort of governing bodies about discrimination, labor boards. I'm basically saying the only way that I will get this money is if I will not or have not ever complained against this company for discrimination, harassment, any of the above.
Right.
So now we have this other process around like companies being able to discriminate against people and get away with it because they're basically saying, we're going to give you money so you don't ever complain against us. Yeah. And now if I want to complain, if I want to go through a discrimination clause, which in Canada, again, there's other things behind the scenes that are going on. For example, it was just proven that the Human Rights Commission of Canada, which oversees all of this, the government of Canada just proved last year that they were discriminating against Black employees. And that most race-based discrimination cases were actually governed and overseen by majority white panels. So this battle is just so entrenched, it's so big. Yeah. And we can't let lawmakers and Employment Equity Acts or whatever, governing body be the main reason we do equitable things and stop discriminating. This is where behind the scenes, the stuff that isn't, the big exciting stuff. It's not the big Black History Month event and the big National Indigenous Day event and the big Pride campaign in March. It's do you have 3 steps in place? That's all it might take to say, okay, if somebody is being considered for termination, have we considered, anything that might be discriminatory against them? Have we considered if there's a difference in race or a difference in ethnicity or a difference in gender or a difference in age? Have we taken that into consideration as a check and kind of gone through that list just really quick? Have we considered that, is this only performance based or is it personality based? If it's personality based, do we come back again and say, is this them actually being bad at their jobs? Or is this just that I'm uncomfortable with their tone, with the way they speak, with the way they communicate, because I wasn't raised in the same culture or the same type of family as they were?
Sure.
If we can start to look at those things, we will start to see a lot less discrimination. But again, this is where I'm like, I feel like this episode, the theme, even though it's all over the place, the theme is like HR folks, chief people officers, chief human resources officers, executive leaders, go into your policies and be like, what checks and balances do we have in place? What are we doing behind the scenes to just make sure that these things are considered?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it, and I hear you and I agree, in an ideal world, that would be great. Yeah. But again, as I go through, as I'm hearing you talk and I just reflect on various clients and organizations I've worked with, I was actually just on a panel last night with some HR folks, and we were talking about more of the legal side of things. And when it comes to things like termination, there's a lot that an organization has to consider. So that to me is why I've seen a lot of organizations not have like termination policies, because they try to be very careful so that they can protect themselves should somebody come back and try to retaliate, sue, etc. So I think that's often why we don't see a lot of that. I know that recently, I want to say it was Washington State and also California. Let me just quickly look this up. I'm pretty sure it was the two of them.
Okay.
Yes, so there's an act called Silence No More. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's basically preventing companies
Those
from
clauses.
Enforcing it, right? Those NDAs, if there's something related to discrimination.
Right.
So again, but to your point, like, it's sad that we even have to get to this point where you need a law to reinforce it, right? But I do think there's a lot to be said around policies, but also just thinking about, I talk about this all the time, but like actual processes and procedures, right? I'm going to keep saying this. I've said it like, I don't know how many times over the past few weeks, but I'm like, I don't care if you are ist, right? Sexist, racist, whatever. What I really do want us to think about are, how are our processes reinforcing those versions of oppression? How are our processes and procedures that are impacting people? Are they sexist? Are they racist? Are they ageist? Are they ableist, right? Because that's where we're going to really see the change, to your point. The other thing that I wanted to add is that data about Black women education. Because I remember reading that, I had to look it up, but for whatever reason, people like somehow skewed the data. But from what my understanding is, the numbers were saying that Black women, amongst all like students of color in higher, amongst all Black students in higher ed, have higher rates. But compared to all groups, there are some like still some significant inequities, and I'll add a link in the description.
Yes, please do. I guarantee I was wrong in what I said. I was just, I want to get into it. So let's definitely fact check that.
Yes, definitely. So they are more likely than Black men to earn degrees, bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees, etc. But this is from, I'm looking at oh my gosh, it was AAUW. And so they're talking about, they're saying that Black women are significantly less than white women to enroll in four-year colleges, graduate within 6 years, and go on to earn advanced degrees. So when we look at the bigger map of all demographics, still pretty low, which is unfortunate. And this data is from like a few years ago. So who knows? I'm afraid to see what the data is going to look like after 2023, 24. I'm scared.
See, and this is what's wild. So like literally just pulled up a headline. Black women are the most educated group in the US.
Yeah.
In 2020. So I'm like, okay, we got to get to the bottom of this. Maybe we do another episode or we
we got to dive into this.
Yeah, because this is probably really interesting how it comes to be. Obviously research is really good at like making some things look really bad. Like, I mean, who knows? You know, the people that wrote this might have been like, yay, Black women, but actually they're just trying to get away with like discrimination, because it's really, like as soon as there's like a good thing, people take it, run with it, and are like, oh, what are you talking about? Black women aren't oppressed. Like, that's the next thing that comes out of somebody's mouth, which is so not true.
Right, exactly. I'm going to look at a few other links and add them in the description, but let's say that Black women are the most educated in the U.S. Our conversation today is still about professional spaces in the workforce, and that for a fact, we know Black women are not overachieving and excelling, because exactly what you were talking about today, policies, procedures, processes, like that is impacting and causing such a great inequity, which does not help close, I feel like a lot of times we come back to this conversation about the Black wealth gap, or just the wealth gap in general, and it's not changing.
Right.
Not changing.
Yeah, I think like the nuance too is often, so for example, in academia, there often is a greater sort of openness, not all the time, but there's a greater openness of diversity, right? Again, you just look at the concept of a tenured professor, where they can literally not get fired for saying whatever they want, right? Oftentimes that doesn't protect Black people, that doesn't protect, it protects white men in many cases, because they are, hold the largest amount of professorships. However, there's still a level of like academic freedom that comes in the academic space. And so I can see, again, I'm kind of just like hypothesizing on the fly, why a lot of like there is a safety in academia in some cases where you're like, I'm a bit more free to express myself. Then you go into the corporate world and you have to fit into the mold, right? Like there's a bit more of a mold. I'm not saying there is not one in academia, especially in like Ivy League institutions, but there's a little bit more of a celebration to be like, hey, you're doing something cool and innovative and new, and you can get a grant to study that for the next 2 years and do your master's on some weird topic that no one actually really even, like that's like not that big of a deal. In now you go into like a corporate world and you try to get a job at Goldman Sachs and Facebook and da 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 da, and everybody around you looks the same, and now like the only way to elevate yourself is to sort of shut off what makes you different. And if you stand out, if you are yourself, especially if you aren't like the common denominator in that organization, it's really easy for you to have a target on your back, to start to feel like, okay, if you would only just change the way you communicated your ideas at the board meetings, they would be approved more. Or if you would only just do this, then your manager would like you better, and that would get you your promotion. Like all of those sort of things whittle away. So I think even though there might be a high percentage of Black women that are highly educated, it doesn't mean that once they get into the corporate world or whatever profession they want to go into, that it's still not highly entrenched with people that don't look or talk or think or feel like them, and that they have to pivot and either give up themselves or get out.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, I definitely I could see that. I could definitely see that. I don't know. I know a lot of Black women in academia, and it's
not the place.
I don't know if I would say it's any better, honestly, because I've been like for the past 3-4 years now toying with the idea of getting a doctorate, and every time I think I'm gonna do it and I like go talk to some of my friends that are doing it or that have, I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I would survive because I'm not gonna be silenced.
And that's it, right? I know my one friend who was doing a professorship, and she's also a DEI consultant, and it was just like it was not it for her, So I know.
Yeah,
I don't have any solutions. That's the reality. Should we end there?
Oh goodness. Well, this has been great. I love having conversations about all things DEI, in particular when it comes to systems and processes, because I think that to me that is where we need to focus so much of our attention. I think there's if I were to prioritize things in the DEI space, it would be first educating people and getting people comfortable and confident with just the use of language that we use within DEI, because if you don't have that, it makes it much harder to then talk about things like pay equity and what's your termination policy and how are you deciding on how to close pay gaps and things like that. And then to me, the second step after we get the language together is, okay, let's look at our systems, processes, policies, etc. Again, I think programmatic efforts like Heritage Months and ERG support, all very necessary and should be running concurrently while you're doing these things. But if I had to advise an organization that had limited resources, time, energy, money, people, directed towards educating the people that are making the decisions and then getting those people together to make decisions to create more equitable systems and processes. That's it. That's all I got for today.
That's it. That's all we got for today, folks.
Any final thoughts?
Honestly, I think
Any final thoughts on your end?
It's the final thought of this work isn't fun. It's not easy. It's not overnight. And y'all, if you are preaching the DEI thing, if you're out there saying, hey, our company believes in DEI and equity and da 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 da, DEI includes equity, but if you're really preaching that message and you're not looking at your policies, you're just gonna keep running into brick walls.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. Well,
Bless.
right. That's all we have for today. Again, check out the links below. I'll add some resources for people to check out. I'll add contact information below if you're interested in chatting with either of us
And
further.
watch out soon because Adriel is going to be on my podcast, the Culturing
Yes,
Podcast, very soon. So
yes,
you'll have
super
another.
excited.
Maybe that's what we do our podcast on is,
Yeah,
you know,
there we go.
women's education, different gaps in education to the corporate world. I'm seeing something. We need to do more research and come more prepared. No, just kidding. It's good. We're just gonna keep learning, right? And that's the thing. None of us know it all.
That's the beauty of this space, right? I think it's just continuous learning, and I think it's helpful. We're both mindful of it, so
Yep.
for
That's
me,
all
I'm
we can
like
ask
I'm
for.
adding the links below. You read it, you figure out what you need to know from that.
Exactly.
But I think it's helpful to have reputable resources, and we're here to continue to provide resources to people and share what we know. So keep coming back. Go subscribe if you have not already. Like this, share it, all that good stuff. Add a comment or not. And yeah, we'll see y'all back here very soon. All right, y'all. Bye.
Bye.